Dear friends, I'm really excited today to be able to have some nice warm weather to show you how to do a batik crackle on fabric. I've sat all through these winter months thinking, oh, I'm desperate to do this, and the weather hasn't been right because we don't have a lot of space for leaving things out to dry here in the UK. So today we've got a lovely warm day and a nice sort of gentle breeze which will dry my fabric. So this is a mock batik effect. It's not one that one would traditionally do with wax. So, oopsie, in Eastern countries, they will often map out a design in wax using this little tool called a shantang. And with this little tool, they will mark out their designs, let the wax harden, and then once it's actually hardened, they will dye the fabric rather than use paint. But we don't always have tools like this, and we don't always necessarily want to spend a lot of time doing that technique. So this is a technique that is widely used in South Africa because we spend so much time outside eating. Quite a lot of people paint plain pieces of fabric with beautiful, beautiful designs as tablecloths, and the colors are beautiful and big and bold. And in Zimbabwe, they do quite a lot of this technique, but they use a lot of watered down fabric paints for that. And it's quite interesting because they will lay their fabrics out on a tennis court to do it. And I'll try and find some pictures to show you what that is. But the things that we're going to need for today are very, very simple. You're going to need some pre-washed cotton fabric. You're going to need a design of some sort. And I've just taken two little hearts because I thought that would be really easy for you. You'll need a pencil. You'll need some flour. Now I've just got regular self-raising flour. That's what I have at the moment. You could use plain flour, that's fine. And you're going to need a little bit of water and a paintbrush. Probably suggest using a nice big fat brush like this because you don't want to take too long doing your design. And then the next thing that I would also strongly suggest is that when you're doing this technique, do it on some kind of a surface that you can potentially move if it's a smaller piece. Obviously if it's big, you're going to have to leave things in situ so that they can dry. So I've just got an old Amazon packaging, one of these kind of envelope things, and I'm going to use that as my base. So I'm going to show you the same design but in two different ways, and it won't make a lot of sense until I actually start doing it. So let me start by saying I'm going to just do two little hearts. I'm not making this up into anything as a finished product. I really want to show you the technique more than anything else, but you can make this to suit any design that you're doing. So I'm going to lightly trace this little heart design with my pencil, trying not to go too hard because I don't want to see the pencil line at the end of the day. Just enough to be visible. If you have one of those tailor's pencils, you can also use those. Oopsie. And where do I want this one? Oh, maybe like that. And if you have a stencil, you could use a stencil as long as it's a pretty open design like a heart and hasn't got lots of little bridges in between. Bridges being those pieces of plastic that join the various sections together. Or you could actually print something off the internet that you could actually use as a guide, or just freestyle if you've got a creative lean and you want to actually do your own design. Right, so I'm going to do a pretty similar design here, just two hearts. And I'm not taping my designs onto my card because the medium that I'm going to be using to create my resist, which will create the batik crackle, is actually going to get quite wet. And when the fabric gets quite wet, it does tend to stretch ever so slightly, and then it will shrink back again. So it's not going to help me when I'm coming to paint the medium on. Right, so I have my two designs. So I'm going to move my template out the way. And now that you can, I wonder if you can see those lines. Okay, so you can see here I've drawn little lines on the fabric. So for the first design, I'm actually going to paint the inside of the heart in the resist. And the resist is flour mixed with water. I know it sounds pretty brainless, but that's what it is. And It works really, really effectively. The second design that I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the background in the resist and leave the heart a plain color. So I'm going to start, and it's going to make more sense as I work through this. So I have here about 6 teaspoons of flour, and I'm wanting to mix this up into a fairly thickish paste. So you know, when you're baking and making sauces and things, you just add the water in slowly and just gradually do it rather than have too much. And I'm not quite sure whether I'm going to have mixed up enough for both of these, but we'll just see how we go. Right, so get the flour to mix nicely with the water before you start adding more. And that shouldn't take too long. Now you could use a little squeeze bottle to put this mixture into if you wanted to do a fine design. But remember, flour is alive, and if you leave your mixture in your squeeze bottle for too long, the bottle is going to push out and swell because of the active ingredients in the flour, and you probably won't be able to use that bottle afterwards because it will distort too much. So once you've finished using things, if you do put it in a squeeze bottle, then just make sure that you clean out all the remaining flour and water. Right, so I'm getting this to bind together nicely, and you're wanting it to be sort of like a thick sloppy cream consistency. So take your time to get the mixture right, and then the rest will be easy. You don't want it doughy like bread dough where it's sticking together and it's looking glutinous like that. It needs to be paintable. Right, so I'm just removing all the little bits that are around the edges of the bowl. There we go, combining all of that. Now let's add the extra water in. When I was teaching classes, we had tremendous fun doing this technique because I was fortunate back home to have a huge big courtyard, so we could put, what would you call it here, table tack or tacky glue, the kind of glue that's like on those peanut notepads. We called it stencil glue, so we would coat boards with that, and then we would stick our fabric on there, and that really didn't allow it to move while we were painting. And then we would do this technique outside because we could actually get the resist that we're going to be painting on to dry quite quickly in the heat in South Africa. So that was quite fun. We'd have a whole load of us all sitting outside painting. You want to try and get some of the lumps out, but a few lumps not that serious unless you are actually using a bottle with a nozzle. And I am showing you this because it is important to see what consistency we're aiming for. So the flour is going to start to absorb the moisture, and as you mix it more and more, you'll see that it's just going to be more paintable. Right, so I'm fairly happy with that result, and I can work with that, and I can actually add more flour into that if I need to. So starting with design number 1, I'm going to now take my mixture and carefully paint that on the inside of my design. So this is not like normal paint where when you spread it, it actually goes on beautifully smooth and even. And I know right now you're having a little bit of difficulty in seeing what I'm painting, but I have to paint this onto a light colored fabric in order for me to be able to put a color on. So just bear with me, I'll lift it up to the light so you can see. So I'm just using a soft bristle brush here just to get into all the corners and along the edge of my heart. Try and be as neat as possible if you want a really crisp outline. And you'll see I'm using my hand just to pull the fabric and keep it taut while I'm painting. Now you don't want this to go on too thinly because ultimately you want it to be thick enough so that when it dries you can actually crack it and make little cracks in this flour and water resist, which is the magic part of this. So once you've actually got your initial coat on and you've done your outlines, then just layer it on a little bit more so that you've got that nice consistency that you can play with. Right, so I'm just going to repeat the second one here. Just again using my little brush just to neatly get the outline. Using my fingers just to pull the fabric away from the center where it's wanting to pull in. It does feel very different to painting with paints because it is a bit goopy, as you can probably see, and yeah, it is fun. It's quite a magical thing to do with children as well, because when they start to paint this, they can't quite see the finished concept, as I'm sure some of you might not be able to see the finished concept, and when you start to put the actual color on, it really does come through beautifully. Makes everything just pop and makes it worthwhile. So what you will notice when you do this design, that the water is going to soak out from the flour and water resist, and you might see like a wet trail around the outside edge of your heart, and you think, oh gosh, it's bleeding. But don't worry about that, because it's only the water that is actually soaking away, and that will dry. It's where you've put the flour that is actually going to resist the paint. Right, so on design number 1, just so you can see a bit more clearly, you'll see I've got my flour and water there, and I can see here up at the top of this heart I've missed a spot, so it's quite a good idea just to check these little areas first before you leave them to dry. Any sort of dry looking spots will just pick up all the paint when you come to do your design a bit later, so do make sure you've got that covered. Right, so that's design number 1. I'm just going to put that there. Now for this one, I'm going to swap to using a slightly bigger brush, because I want to be, well, let me use the small one to do around the outline. I want to do the background of this. So first of all, I'm going to use the small one just to define my heart, so that I get a nice outline. And the reason why I'm doing these 2 different designs is just to show you how different they look once we've painted. It's a bank holiday here today, and it's just lovely to have this sort of stillness outside, but also hear the voices of the little kids running around. They're all excited. They're going to be heading off to the beach. You can hear them chatting to their parents and saying they're off to the beach. You probably wonder why I'm listening to these conversations, but I'm in flats, so yeah, we can hear what happens with people walking below. Right, so outlining both the hearts, taking a bit of care with that, and when I come to do the rest of the background, I'll just swap to a bigger brush. Right, let me just turn this so I can use my brush more effectively to reach this edge. There we go. Do take care with the edges, because that will really affect the shape of your design. Right, so this little area here is quite narrow, so I'm just going to fill that in with my smaller paintbrush while I'm there. Just move that up a bit. There we go. So how's your week been? We're at the sort of end of May here now, and really in a busy planting season at work, and it's just been joyous because during the course of the cooler months we've been growing in the greenhouse and polytunnels loads and loads of sunflowers. So we've got a big field next to the area where I work. I'm also in a big field, but mine is I suppose, for want of a better description, like a giant allotment. And the field next to me is used by the farm for some part of the year to let the animals graze there, but for the oopsie that I don't want. But for the rest of the year, in this really nice warm months, they have tents parked there. So they are glamping tents, but these tents are for family camps, and it's really lovely to see all the families there. But polytunnels aren't the nicest things to look at, so we plant along our fence line that borders the camping site rows and rows and rows of sunflowers. I think we've planted a couple of hundred of them, and they wake up in the morning with their tents and they look across the field to the faces of the sunflowers all facing them, because the sun rises in that direction. And I must say, every year people just comment on how joyous it is to wake up to see the sunshine and the sunflowers facing them. Right, so now I've moved to a big brush, and you'll see that this will go on quite quickly. It's creating a little bit of texture as you're working, but don't worry about that. And I'm just going to paint it on thickly, but try and do it evenly. And this is going to take a couple of hours to dry. It needs to be bone dry. Don't try using hair dryers and ovens and those sort of things to dry this. You want this just to dry naturally, because otherwise you're going to create other effects which aren't necessarily to do with this technique. Where it's very thick, you want to maybe just smooth it out a little bit. And as I said earlier when I was doing the single hearts, just be very careful about having your mixture too thin, because you won't be able to crackle it with nice decent sized cracks that will make part of your design interesting. Right, so we've got one positive design, which is where I've coloured the heart in completely, and this heart is what we'd call a heart which is negative because it's got no colour in it, but ultimately it will have paint in it. Right, how am I going to do this without getting too sticky? Let's start holding up that end. And you can see as I'm working that the fabric is stretching a little bit. If you've put your fingers onto the fabric there, you will have lifted up some of the resist, so you're going to have to go back and just brush over it, unless you're confident that that area is going to be in a seam. Alright, so make sure that you cover all of it. Don't have any little dry bits, because otherwise that will just reflect as a blob of paint when you actually get there. Right, that's great. And not a difficult process. We use this a lot as backgrounds when we were painting tablecloths, because you could get this gorgeous background or a border without actually having to do too much intricate detail. And painting an area to make it look smooth with fabric paints on its own can be quite difficult unless you've had a bit of practice. So this is always a foolproof way of getting things done quite quickly. Yeah. Nice and sticky now. Let's turn the fabric so that I can work more easily, pulling it towards me. That's better. And then, as I said, I'm going to leave this to dry for a couple of hours. And then when it's dried completely, I'll come back and show you what it looks like. The fabric is going to do some really strange things. So first of all, as I said to you, you might get a bit of water bleeding out. Secondly, what you will find too is that when you've done a large background area like I'm doing right now, you are going to see that the fabric's going to crinkle a little bit and it's going to look really ugly. So there are a couple of things I want to show you. So I'm going to move these and lift this up, and on the first hearts that we did here, you can see that this is starting to dry and it's starting to go slightly more yellow and creamy. When you're doing big background areas, this is what you want to look out for, these little spots where there's no resist, because that's going to just be a blob of paint. So now I'm going to check over this and make sure there's another one. Make sure I've covered all of this before I continue. So going over here, covering my fingerprints and that little blob there. Right, I think I'm good to go. Another bit there. It's very easy not to cover everything, so do check this properly. Right, so you can see here that even though we've covered quite a large surface, we haven't used an awful lot of this flour and water resist. We could probably have done with half of it, but I haven't done it for so long I actually wasn't sure. Now I'm going to set this aside and leave this to dry completely, and when it's dry I'm going to come back and show you the next step. Right, so here we are, this glorious moment of seeing what it's all going to turn out to look like. I have allowed my flour and water resist to dry quite nicely. So you will notice on the front side that the colour is a lot lighter and that there are little cracks starting to form in the flour and water. One of the things that you can look for on the back of your fabric is to see all these little wrinkly kind of bits, and that will give you an indication of where your cracks might be depending on how you crumple your fabric. So if we have a look at this where we've just done the hearts, you can see first of all the colour is lighter, and again we've got that wrinkly little bit on the back. So I'm going to start off with this one, and I'm just going to gently start to crackle this, and you can see I'm rotating the fabric in my hands so that I'm not getting the cracks in all the same places. I want them to go in different directions. And you can be fairly firm with this. At this stage, your fabric, if you've painted the whole background, is going to feel like really old stiff parchment, you know, like an old map of some sort. And I want my lines to be irregular, because wherever I have a little crack, that's where I'm hoping that the paint is going to penetrate in the fabric. So let's have a look here and just see how the little cracks are coming. There's some there. There's a few little ones there. I'm going to be bold. I'm going to take this in my hands and just scrumple it like that, because it's not an incredibly thick application, and that should do the trick. Once more, I think, just so that we've got cracks in all direction. Right, so what I want to do now is to paint around the hearts, and I think that what I'm going to do is paint this in this lovely watermelon pink. It's important at this stage that you actually work with a dry brush, and also that you know that you're going to have to kind of push the paint into these little cracks. If you've got water in your brush, it stands a chance of actually diluting the flour and water resist. So I'm going to start along this edge, because I want a nice definition to my little heart. And just a word of caution that the color that you see on top of the flour and water is not what you're going to see when it all comes off, because the flour and water ultimately is going to be removed from the fabric. So you're going to have a very subtle design with this particular one, because we're going to have little pink veins and this calico color heart. So I'm using this chisel shaped brush just to edge my design nicely, so that I get a good shape to it, and then I will be a little bit bigger and bolder with my brush strokes to get the rest of the paint on. So the fabric paint that I'm using is one that I've brought from South Africa. It's got a transparent base, and I'm sure that you're able to get that kind of fabric paint in most countries where you live. If you use an acrylic paint, it is a thicker sort of mixture, and you might not find that you get the same results, but by all means just play around. Right, so I just want to, before I continue, just edge the second heart, and just take your time when you're going around the design. I do find chisel shaped brushes are really nice to get into these small little bits. Any sort of sharp corners you want to just ease out. There's a sharp little corner. Right, as I said, this is going to be slightly more subtle than you think it is, because you see the color sitting on top of the flour and water at this stage, and you think, oh, that's lovely, it's a bright pink, but it won't be that. It's going to be mostly creamy color with a few little crackle veins. Right, so as I'm working now, moving forward to do the rest of the background, I'm really needing to brush the paint into these little crackles. So just have a look over here, and you can see all these little crackles that have formed, and I'm needing to push the paint in those lines. It's a bit like doing that sort of antique crackle look when you are doing decoupage. You need to push the paint into those cracks. So you could at this stage change to a round brush, or you could just apply a bit of pressure to your design. In fact, I think I might just change to a round brush so I can show you. In fact, I'm going to use this stippling brush that we use for stenciling, because that will push the paint in nicely. Really rub it in. You don't want a thick layer of paint on the top. It's going to serve no purpose, because it's just going to wash out at the end. So I'm going to cover my entire surface with this. And one of the ways that you'll be able to see whether the color is penetrating to the back is if you just turn it over from time to time to see if you're getting any little veins. Right, so let's just have a look over here, and you'll start to see that there's some bits of color coming through here, and that will be where the color is coming through to make the crackle look. I'm just going to carry on, and I'm at this stage putting a lot of pressure on this to get the paint to go through the starch. You'll see that the fabric as I'm working is starting to flatten out, making it a little bit easier to work on, because it was very stiff and crunchy to begin with. I would caution you against using dyes at this stage, because if you use a dye for this kind of method, you're going to find that when you are working, that the dye is going to dilute the flour and water, and it's just going to smudge your design. But if you were using wax as a resist, then obviously a dye is completely suitable, because the wax will be hardened and it's not going to lift off the fabric easily. So once we have completed painting our design, we will going to let the fabric dry again, and then you're going to take your iron, and on the back you're going to iron with a hot dry iron. I would actually put a sheet of paper down so that this design with the paint is on a piece of paper face downwards, and then once you've done that, give it a good iron for about 2 to 3 minutes with a hot dry iron, and that's going to set your fabric paint colors. And then you're going to put your whole design into some water to wash out the flour and water, so you'll only be left with the little veins. Right, so let's just get this to the end. And you do have to work this in, because you know, if your cracks are quite fine like this, you're going to need to make sure that they've got an opportunity to soak through into the fibers of the fabric. Right. Right, so I'm just going over all the areas where I've still got wet paint, just pushing the paint really firmly into the fabric. And at this stage, the flour and water will have become damp again, so don't overwork it, and then just start to rub your cracks out. So if we turn it over, you'll see that there's quite a lot of mottled little marks. Can you see that? All the little marks showing through. That's what's going to show through on our design when we come to lift the flour and water. Right, check that you've got no large areas of just white where you haven't put paint. There we go. And obviously the side that we did first, which is this top area here, that will have more pronounced effect than the side that we've just done, but it is starting to penetrate. Right, I'm going to set that aside, and now I'm going to work on the second design. But the second design, we're actually only going to crackle the hearts. So just make sure my fingers are working. We're going to just take these little hearts. You can see that they've dried nicely. We're going to crumple this all up quite firmly, and then I'm just going to use the soft brush to begin with to get a nice outline. I'm still in frame, sorry, I do tend to move things around on my desk. If you saw how small my filming area and my actual workspace was, you'd have a laugh. So I do tend to sometimes move things closer to me, which is not good. Right, so I'm going to paint this on, and then I'll go over this with a stippling brush once I've got my outlines done nice and neatly. So now I'm going to have the same design, but I'm going to have a creamy white background with a little heart with a crackle in it. So the real time factor here is just waiting for things to dry. So in terms of that, it's quite nice to do this over a period of days. You know, each step of the process is actually quite quick. Just waiting for things to dry, a bit like decoupage. You're waiting for things to dry. I just love the surprise that each design brings, because you never quite know how it's all going to turn out until you've actually washed the flour and water out. Okay, so I've got a nice shape to my heart here. Just going to put a bit more paint on so that I've got something that I can rub in, because I can see some of the area has dried quite quickly, like these edges here. And then before I do the second heart, I'm just going to switch to my stippling brush, and I'm just going to really push that into the fibers of the fabric. Be careful about going right over the edges of your design. Cool. And now I'm going to do the second one. If you do try this, or you have tried it in the past, please just give me a little comment in the comments box below. I would love to know what you've done and how your results turn out. I think it's like baking, except I'm not very good at baking, but we'll all have the same starting point, and yet everybody is so unique in how their end result turns out. Right, so just making sure I've got a nice line here, nice shape to my design. Okay, so let's just go over the next steps. The next steps are iron on the back with a hot dry iron. Preferably put your painted side down onto a piece of paper, and that will protect your ironing board. And then when you've done that, iron with a hot dry iron for 2 to 3 minutes. That's going to fix the fabric paints onto the fabric. And then we're going to rinse this in some cold water to wash off the actual flour, and with that will come this solid area of the pink paint. So it's quite easy. And once you've done this, you can actually go ahead, you could make a little bag, you could add some embroidery to this, you could cut these into smaller pieces and make them into a little bag, or some part of a journal, part of a journal cover. There's lots of options, but I'm not going to go that step further in this because I just want to show you the technique. Right, so having pushed this all the way through, quickly flip over. You can see it's starting to penetrate there nicely, and I'm just going to leave that to dry. So once it's completely dry, I will show you what it looks like before I wash it. Well, here we have our gorgeous little hearts that have dried nicely. And before I remove the flour and water resist, I think I've mentioned to you once before, but I'm going to say it again because it is really important. You're going to put a piece of paper over the painted side and iron with a hot dry iron for 2 to 3 minutes to fix the color, so that the color doesn't lift out when we come to remove the actual resist. One of the ways you can see whether this has worked or not is just to simply flip your design over, and here you will see how beautifully the little veins have popped through here. You can see the colors. It's going to be surprising because it won't always be as you expect it to be. This one, because there's a much larger surface area that we've painted, if we turn that over, you'll see that there's got a lot more markings. So the area where we had the resist and put the paint, we've got the markings, but the heart itself remains uncolored. So I'm going to go and iron these first, and then I'm going to rinse them in cold water just to lift the flour and water resist. And as I mentioned to you before, don't expect all this to be background color. It's just going to be those little veins at the back. And then once it's dry, I'll bring that back and show you what it looks like. Well, here we are. I've rinsed out the flour and water resist, and look at this lovely textured background you've got that's created this faux batik look. I'm really thrilled with it. The little sort of crackles and things are really nice and delicate. And remember, we did 2 different things. We first of all painted the background around the hearts, and then the second one, what we did was we actually painted the resist on the hearts. And again, I'm very happy with those little veins and things that we've got there. So this leaves you now with a blank canvas that you can actually work on. So you might want to take something like embroidery cotton and just go around the outside of the hearts just to define them. You could use something like a fabric liner to do that, but you will see that that will just bring the design up a little bit further forward. You could cut them out and stick them onto something. You could use these as book covers. You could use them as part of a quilting design, especially if you were doing this background with all these lovely, lovely markings, just as a fabric for quilting, or yeah, another mixed media project. But I'm very happy with those. So thank you for joining me today, and I hope that this has given you some ideas of something that you can do using this flour and water resist. Everything's in your kitchen, so easy to do. And really it just takes drying time, so it's one of those things that you could do at home, do a little bit, go off, cook the dinner, come back, do the kids' homework, come back, and you're not having to sit and do it from start to finish. It's one of those nice easy projects. But if you've enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing to my channel and give me a thumbs up, and I'd love to hear from you if you've got any comments about what we've done today. Thanks for joining me. Bye for now.